This book, the most important part about it is the dedication I'm going to read to Abbas Milani, visionary scholar and teacher. And I'm really thrilled that he's here. Let me begin by explaining why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because, like most Iranians, I have been in anguish about Iran and the revolution. I was one of the thousands, hundreds of thousands, who went from the West to Iran in '79. And on the route, I drove from England to Iran, and on the route we were just so happy. Naive, but happy. And then, within a few years, we were all in despair. And I think most of us, whether we experience that or we're the children of people who experience that, we've been wondering what happened. Why did that happen? And over the last 40 years or so, asking that question as a psychologist, I attempted to find psychological reasons for what happened. And I discovered that psychologists have shown almost no interest in revolutions. The last book that was published with the title of The Psychology of Revolution was by Le Bon, a Frenchman, back in 1894. There is a lot of psychological research on collective mobilization, and I've been part of that research, looking at under what conditions people mobilize to join a revolution. But for me, the most important part of a revolution is actually not the mobilization and the regime change. It is what happens after regime change. That is the challenge. Let me read a quote from a revolutionary who we've all heard of, Karl Marx. He says, "All human history is nothing but a continuous transformation of human nature." That's page 179 in this book. All human history is nothing but a continuous transformation of human nature. That is what revolutionaries want to achieve. They want to speed up history and change what they see as human nature towards their ideal. The question is, why is it that people who are revolutionaries and in search of democracy, as I think we all were, why is it that we fail? And why is it that the dictatorship returns? That's the main question I had. I want to give some big picture issues. One is, in discussing the psychology of revolution, we have to think about two big picture issues. One is the distinction between a cyclical view of history and a progressive view of history. I start this book with a quotation from the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats. The poem is very short. It's called The Great Day. Hurrah for revolution and more cannon shot. A beggar upon horseback lashes a beggar on foot. Hurrah for revolution and cannon come again. The beggars have changed places, but the lash goes on. That is a cyclical view of history, and it's in line with the great Italian theorist Vilfredo Pareto. His elite theory basically says, yes, there will be revolutions, but all societies are always governed by elites. The elites will use different kinds of fronts. It might have a communist front or a religious front, socialist front, capitalist front. This is all just a mirage. What happens behind the scene is the elite rules. That is a cyclical view of history. An alternative view is a Marxist view, for example, that we are marching towards the proletariat revolution and the classless society, or something closer to Stanford. You might have known about a book called The End of History. When the Soviets collapsed, the end of history thesis was that the end of communism means that capitalist democracy has won, and this is the end of history. I tend not to believe in an end to history. As a psychologist, I believe that we can determine our future in many different ways, but there are limits. And my psychological research is focused on what are the limits of change. What can we not change? When we have a revolution, what is stopping us from moving towards democracy? What are the limitations psychologically? So that's what I'm focused on today. From the research on revolutions, I selected just 5 revolutions. On pages 6 and 7 in this book, I review some literature on variations on revolutions. Some people argue there have been hundreds of revolutions. I only select 5. I don't select the American Revolution, and I can explain the reasons why. I selected the French, the Russian, the Chinese, the Cuban, and the Iranian revolutions. I see those as the classic and most important revolutions in at least modern history. And I can explain why not the American Revolution. What I focus particularly on is what happens after regime change, and I use 2 concepts that I introduce. One is political plasticity. Political plasticity is how much, in what ways, and how fast change can be brought about. And in what ways can it not be brought about? What are the areas where we have high political plasticity? And what are the areas that we have low political plasticity? Now, you've probably all heard of the term brain plasticity. I am not concerned just with what is plasticity in the brain. I argue that hardwiring is not just in here, it is also out there. Before we were born, there was already a built environment with architecture and planning. Before we were born, there was already a cultural system and narratives. And after we leave this world, those hardwirings will continue. And they shape our behavior. So I'm not just concerned with hardwiring in the brain, I'm concerned with hardwiring out there. And it includes literature, it includes mythologies, it includes the tales and poetry we teach our children. That is the hardwiring that controls our behavior and continues through what I call cultural carriers. What is a cultural carrier? It is a means by which we propagate values and culture. For example, in the United States, the American flag is a cultural carrier. You might say, well, it's just a piece of cloth. But people are willing to die for that piece of cloth. Similarly, the hijab is just a piece of cloth. But some people are willing to kill and die for that piece of cloth. It is a means through which we propagate values. So looking at carriers and how they continue through revolutions, after revolutions, looking at hardwiring and looking at political plasticity. In the book, I discuss psychological theories about mobilization and regime change. These theories are basically categorized into two groups. Theories that assume that material factors are the most important in mobilizing people, and theories that argue that it is psychological, subjective factors that are the drivers. Now, on the basis of these theories that I don't want to go into the detail of now, because I'm more interested in what happens after the revolution. On the basis of these theories, I identified a number of factors that are very important for mobilizing people. And I list them under number 7 in this outline that I hope you all have. What are the conditions in which we can get people to mobilize? First of all, they have to be aware of an alternative, better society. They have to see an alternative. At the moment, one of the challenges in Iran is people say, well, if this regime goes, what comes after? The alternative is not very clear. So we have to have a clear alternative. Second, there has to be dissatisfaction with the existing society. People have to be dissatisfied and interpret the dissatisfaction as not being their own fault. So it's not my fault that I'm dissatisfied. And to see the ruling regime as responsible for the dissatisfaction. See the ruling regime as illegitimate. And believe that it can be overthrown. Here we get to a critical point. People have to come to believe that the regime can be overthrown. And that the fall of the regime will result in a better regime, and that they must sacrifice for that better regime. So those are the basic requirements that I see psychologically, what has to be in the belief system of people to become engaged and to mobilize against a regime so that it falls. One of the things I find fascinating about regime change is that it's so difficult to predict. It is extremely difficult to predict when it's going to happen. And this is notorious, obvious in the French Revolution. When is the king going to fall? In the Russian Revolution, Lenin was actually stuck in Switzerland when the regime fell. he was stuck there, and in order to get back quickly and insert himself into the revolution, he had to go through a lot of traveling and arrive at a time when the revolution was already underway, and maneuver very cleverly to get himself inserted as a leader, a leader. Of course, the Bolsheviks were a minority. I talk about the image of a dam, thinking about a dam where water is building up behind the dam, and it's not very clear when the dam will burst. And when it bursts, those who want to be seen as leaders have to maneuver very quickly to place themselves at the front of this movement. Now, one of the things about regime change is that people are focused on hatred for the regime. They are not focused on the differences between themselves. If we go back to the Iranian Revolution, think about the different forces that were against the regime, the Shah's regime. You had highly educated women. You had left-wing radicals who wanted a socialist state. You had Islamic fanatics, followers of Khomeini, who had actually read and understood what Khomeini was saying. Very few. All these different forces, if they focused on their differences at that time, there would never have been a revolution. But they did not focus on their differences. That's one of the characteristics of revolutions. The different forces that led to the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Part of the aristocracy was involved in the French Revolution. They didn't think about the differences they had with other opponents of the current regime. They just thought about their opposition to the regime. Once regime change comes into place, the picture suddenly changes. When regime change comes into place, everything changes, and it's here that we have to think about political plasticity. Because all these different groups with contradictory goals have been attempting to topple the regime. Once they succeed to topple the regime, now they have to try to work towards the goals they have. Some of them have the goal of creating a democracy. Some of them have the goal of grabbing power. This is where personality factors come in as very important. There's a repeated pattern we find after revolutions and regime change. Initially, the moderates have the power. Initially, they are positioned in the best place. Now, what are the personality characteristics of moderates? Typically, the moderates are people like us. One of their characteristics is that they are not willing to kill easily. Are you willing to kill me because I don't believe in what you believe in? No. And I'm not willing to kill you. But that's not the case with the extremists. See, in terms of personality style, there is a distinct difference between the extremists. We go to Mao and the Red Guard. The Red Guard were a different group. They were not like us. They were willing to kill because they saw somebody as an intellectual, as somebody who was opposing their cultural revolution. In Iran, students in the line of the Imam, Danishjuay Khat Imam, they were willing to obliterate people. Why? Because they were not standing in the right place, they were in their way. After the revolution, there's a critical difference between personality styles. The personality styles of moderates tend to be lenient. They tend to want to negotiate. They tend to want to give and take and reach some kind of settlement. I remember Bazargan in the first year trying to maneuver, trying to get different groups involved and agreements. The extremists were not in the least interested in negotiating with Bazargan. They wanted power, just as the Bolsheviks wanted power in Russia, just as Castro wanted power in Cuba. The extremists who come to power gradually in the first phase, they are categorical thinkers. Cognitively, they think categorically. I am right, you are wrong. If you are not with me, then I have to obliterate you. That's why you find such ruthlessness in the first initial phase once there is this competition between the extremist factions and the moderates. They have low tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for ambiguity is a psychological cognitive measure. To what extent do you see the world as complex, intertwining, interrelated? To what extent do you see differences as fuzzy? And to what extent do you see the world as black and white, right and wrong? The extremists also have a different relationship with leadership. They believe in absolute obedience to their leader. You see this with Lenin. You see this with Mao. You see this with Khomeini. Let me read you a report on Lenin. Lenin was personally beyond challenge as leader of the party. Everyone saw him as the senior figure. It was unthinkable that anyone would criticize Lenin personally in the terms he used to reprimand others. Lenin was a prophet among disciples. Reprimands only went in one direction. By 1920, Lenin had made himself into a kind of philosopher king. He was conducting a nationwide seminar based on hypotheses which Lenin took as undeniable axioms. Indeed, the legitimacy he claimed for himself and his government did not arise from a clear popular mandate, but from his philosophical claim to possess the correct policies and consciousness of the ruled, even if the ruled did not see it in that way. He was, in this respect, a secular equivalent of theocratic leaders who derived their legitimacy from the truth of their doctrines, not popular mandates. I could have been reading about Khomeini. one of the areas in which there is low political plasticity is leader-follower relations. We learn to follow leaders in a particular style. And this learning comes from childhood. It doesn't start at the age of 25 or 30. From early childhood, we learn how to follow leaders, and this style of followership is very difficult and slow to change. It has low political plasticity, and it is situated there and supported there through the hard wiring in culture. It is something that continues after revolutions. And I believe this low political plasticity and the hard wiring in the culture explains why, again and again, after the great revolutions, we find one dogmatic leader, dictator, replaced by another. We go back to the French Revolution. The king is toppled. Eventually, we get Emperor Napoleon. The Russian Revolution, the Tsar is toppled. We get Lenin and Stalin, and now we have Tsar Putin. In the Chinese Revolution, the emperor is toppled. We get Emperor Mao. Cuba, we've had the Castro brothers, and now their descendants. And in Iran, of course, we had the Shah toppled, and we got the next dictators. What I'm pointing to is continuity of behavior after revolutions and low political plasticity in a way that is very difficult to stop if the moderates continue to act as they have. And I'm going to talk about this a little later. The challenge of what the moderates have to do in order to overcome this problem. And it is a huge problem. The other aspect of continuity after revolutions arising because of the style of leadership, the other aspect is corruption. If you follow behavior before and after revolutions, what you find is corruption is continuous, and the reason for this is the same as it is before the revolution as after the revolution. In systems where you cannot question authority, corruption inevitably arises. The old adage is, absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you go to Iran now, or if you go to China, or if you go to Russia, Cuba, these places where you cannot question the leadership, the authority that is derived from the leadership descends down and corrupts the entire society. So there is continuity of corruption. There's a wonderful index, the International Corruption Index, that lists all the countries in the world and how corrupt they are. And you'll see that the dictatorships are right at the bottom. The more open societies are less corrupt at the top. So that's another continuity before and after the revolutions. Now, after revolutions, I mentioned that the extremists use brute force to grab power, but that's not going to be enough. As I read the quote from Lenin, he sees history as a continuous struggle to change human nature. What does he mean? He means we have to change behavior, basically. We've got to change people. We've taken power, we have our goals, we have our ideals, and now we have to change people towards those ideals. That's why I see psychology as central to revolutions. The Soviets understood this very well. After the 1917 revolution, once they got to power, they thought, how do we create the new Soviet citizen? And they had a bright idea. They said, we will use psychology. And they tried to use American behaviorism to change citizens to create the new Soviet citizen. Trotsky was very enthusiastic about this. But of course, like many revolutionaries who was not extreme enough, he became a victim. Stalin was out to get him, and even when Trotsky escaped to Mexico, one of Stalin's agents found him and killed him there. But the point here is that the revolutionaries have to change behavior. And here is what I get to again, back to political plasticity. What is preventing them from creating that Soviet citizen? They have plans for collectivization. They have plans for creating new types of cities and communities. What is preventing them? They have absolute power. In China, Mao had absolute power. What prevented him from implementing a collective society? Why is it that China is back to using capitalist systems? What prevents them is low political plasticity in certain types of behavior. For example, they established collective farms. Now they have to motivate individuals to work collectively for collective rewards. It turned out that it was extremely difficult to do this. There's psychological research on this under the title social loafing. Social loafing. The phenomena is this. When you put a group of people together and give them a task, you know what happens. A few of those people just drift away and don't do any work. All the work falls to one or two people. There's a wonderful psychology experiment where you bring participants in a room and there is a rope, and you tell the participants your task is to pull on this rope as hard as you can. And there is this individual pulling hard, and there's a gauge that tells you how hard this person is pulling. So he pulls, and it says 20, 25, and he's pulling hard. Now, there are two conditions. One is where the person pulls alone. Second condition, the person comes in and you say, you're going to pull as part of a group. And under both conditions, you blindfold the person because you say, well, we want you to be focused on the task. We're going to blindfold you. You're going to pull as hard as you can. Imagine I'm pulling, I'm blindfolded, and behind me there are 5 other people, and we're all pulling together. This is a psychology experiment, so you know there has to be a trick. In the condition where we're pulling as part of a group, the other people don't pull. They just stand there and watch me pulling. So what we're doing is setting up two conditions. One condition where I think I'm pulling as part of a group, but I'm actually pulling alone. And one condition where I think I'm pulling alone, and I am pulling alone. And the results show that in the United States, participants pull harder when they think they're pulling alone. When they think they're pulling as part of a group, they loaf. That's called social loafing. Now, there is also a research literature on what's called social laboring. Imagine you are in a crew of 8 and you are rowing in a boat. Imagine the Stanford crew. There they are, rowing. Do they loaf? No, they're pulling as hard as they can, and the group actually motivates them to pull harder. So there are certain conditions under which we can get people to work harder in a group. The problem the Soviets had, Lenin and others, was that they couldn't work out under what conditions the Soviet citizen is going to work harder in a group so that their collective farm would work. They didn't work this out well. The result was increased inefficiency, low productivity, and in the end, the Soviet economy was not doing well. This is just one example of revolutionaries having full power, but not having the technical ability to bring about change in behavior in the direction of the revolution. There are many other examples. In Iran, after 40-something years, they are still struggling to change behavior in the direction of the Islam they want. They're still struggling. Why? They don't have the technology, they don't have the techniques, and they haven't worked out in what areas political plasticity is extremely low and people cannot be changed quickly. Now, some revolutionaries have taken very drastic measures to try to achieve behavioral change. Under number 9, I list some of the tactics. The first one is emptying counter-revolutionary vessels. What do I mean by that? Well, the most clear example is the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They wanted to change behavior. They were extremists, and they said, well, one way to change behavior is to change the context. The context of the city is corrupting. It is capitalist. So what do? We kick people out of the city. And that's what they did. They literally kicked millions of people out of the cities in Cambodia. A lot of people died. Imagine if we are suddenly kicked out into the countryside and told, you have to fend for yourself. Start cultivating food. Well, I would die, I know. That was one of their tactics, extremist, but it failed. Mao had the tactic of, first of all, the Great Leap Forward, which was a tragedy, but the Cultural Revolution, he mobilized the Red Guards, young fanatics, and he said, we're going to empty the universities, we're going to empty the offices. Why? Because the offices and the universities are corrupting the young. We're going to empty them. And we're going to kick people out and re-educate them. Khomeini tried exactly the same thing. And there were enormously important similarities. An old extremist, Mao and Khomeini, leading young fanatics, Red Guards, students in the line of the Imam, attacking intellectuals, universities, educated people. What were they trying to do? They were trying to bring about behavior change. It was almost like a giant psychology experiment that failed. Why? Because they did not take into account low political plasticity in certain areas where you cannot change behavior quickly. It's just not going to happen. Another area where they tried to do a mechanism they tried to use has been self-criticism. Self-criticism. This has been used in a number of post-revolution periods where you bring somebody, put them in the middle of the floor and say, okay, tell us about your evil doings, what you've been doing wrong, and people have to confess. And I've seen videos of this, and it's horrifying, some of the things that happen. But the fact is, it doesn't change people. I could come and tell you about all the things I'm doing wrong, but that doesn't mean I'm going to change tomorrow. These are very difficult things after the revolution, where the revolutionaries, the extremists, get power and try to use as much force as they can muster to change behavior. That's their goal, to change behavior. But certain behaviors we know are very difficult to change. I introduce in this book something I call the macro-micro rule of change. It is much easier and faster to change at the macro level often. We can overnight change the economic system. We can transfer ownership overnight. We can create collectives overnight. On paper, we can change everything overnight. But actually changing behavior at the micro level, where you're trying to move cognition and action at the micro level, that is much slower, and even the most radical revolutionaries have discovered that it is much more difficult. The revolutionaries have discussed this themselves. Mao discussed this extensively. Trotsky discussed it under the topic perpetual revolution. Perpetual revolution. Mao is very clear on this. He says there is a tendency for people to backslide. We have a revolution, we kick out the bad people, we bring in a good regime, but people's behavior doesn't change. It keeps backsliding to the old ways, to the capitalist ways. So what do? We have a perpetual revolution, a constant revolution. We have wave after wave of filtering, where the bad people are filtered out. And in Iran, they've tried the same. If you look at what's happened in universities, they have had waves after wave of filtering, where they filter out what they see to be the wrong people. It hasn't worked. The universities have really not changed to become pro-regime in Iran. So what I'm pointing to is this great challenge after revolutions. The great challenge is, how do you change behavior towards your revolutionary ideal? Now, for us, I think the revolutionary ideal is greater freedom, equality between different groups, democracy. How do we achieve that? And that is what you might call the moderate dilemma. As moderates, after each revolution, we have a very brief window of opportunity where we can exert our influence before the radicals come marching in with their guns. The question is, how do we behave? What do we do? If we behave as moderates have done in history, we're not going to win. Not in the short term. Not in the 100 years. We have to rethink how, as moderates, we're going to deal with the extremists. And it can't be the usual way. In one of the last chapters in this book, I talk about the illusion motivation model of revolutions. What has to happen for revolution to come about, and what are the illusions that make revolutions possible? And I talk about two revolutions before regime change. The first is the supreme revolutionary illusion. And this is the illusion that after the revolution, we, with all our different belief systems and interests, we are all going to be better off. That's an illusion. A second illusion is the illusion of unity. That we, with all our different interests and factions, we're actually united. And we're going to stay united after the revolution and regime change. And of course, that's an illusion. That is an illusion that turns out to be very dangerous because the extremists don't have that illusion. It's an illusion shared by us. Now, after regime change, the moderates like us have another illusion, and that is the illusion of rationality. The illusion that things will work out rationally. Again, I keep thinking of Bazargan during the early years when he was trying to work things out in a rational way. I didn't agree with his belief system, but I could see he was trying to work things out rationally. And again, that is an illusion because irrationality is what drives things after revolutions. Irrationality highly based on emotions and relative deprivation. See, before the revolution, the rhetoric is about rights. Everything is about rights. Your rights have been trampled on. You have the right to have a better life. It's about rights. After the revolution, when the regime change has taken place, the rhetoric has to shift to duties. If it remains on rights, people will be equally dissatisfied as they were before. It's to duties, and the moderates miss this. They miss this point. They keep focusing on rights. There needs to be a shift to talk about duties immediately. That's another classic mistake after revolutions. But the extremists also have their illusions. And there are two illusions that the extremists have. One is the illusion of control. That is, after regime change, they have the illusion that they can control behavior. And of course they can't. After each revolution, gradually the ideals that the extremists have disappear because they cannot control behavior. And the other illusion they have is that they are there permanently, the illusion of permanence, the idea that we are here forever. Of course, Hitler had this as well. The Third Reich will last 1,000 years. And Khomeini seems to have that. The illusion of permanence. I wanted to leave enough time for discussion, so I'm going to stop because usually the discussions are very interesting. I'll stop there. Thank you. Please, any questions? Yes?
You didn't mention why you didn't include the American Revolution in your analysis.
Great question. Well, I see the American Revolution as rather like the Algerian Revolution, as a movement against a foreign power. In the case of Algeria, it was the French. In the case of the United States, it was Britain. Now, the other thing about the American Revolution is that, in my view, the changes it brought about were actually minor. It brought about a change in rulership, but if you look at the details, what did it give the people? It gave the vote to free men. It did not give the vote to women or to slaves. That arrangement was already there 2,500 years ago in Athens. Athenian democracy gave the vote to free men, not women, not slaves. So it took another couple of centuries until 1920 before women got the vote, and minorities are still struggling with this issue. So I very much admire the American Revolution in some respects, but I think we have to look at the long term and see what it achieved. So I didn't include it in the list. Yes?
The answer is very interesting, because actually it didn't shift to duty, did it? I mean, it focused on rights in the American Revolution.
Yes, yes. It had a very narrow focus. Yes, sorry.
I'm sorry. So I guess from my vantage point, you seem to have painted a picture that the elasticity of political elasticity, by and large, at least in the example you chose, causes a post-revolution to more or less look like the pre-revolution. So can you entertain us or give us hope by giving us an example where that is not the case, and then tell us how that was different, why that was different?
Well, I make a distinction between within system change and between system change. Between system change is if you go from a dictatorship to a democracy. Within system change is if you go from a dictatorship with one kind of propaganda to a dictatorship with another, which happened in Iran. My argument is that if you look at behavior, not propaganda, if you look at behavior, change through revolution is very, very slow. It doesn't happen quickly. The great revolutions bring about change, but it's a slow, long-term change. Why is that? Well, I believe it is because relationships such as between a leader and follower take a long time to change. It's difficult to change them quickly You have to change the way people think. You have to change the way they relate to each other. But in addition to that, you have to change what I call the hardwiring outside. The Soviets had very radical views on what they wanted to change. For example, some of the Soviets believed that what we call the nuclear family needs to be changed. We need to change relationships. How do they do that? Well, we need to have people living in different size units, in communities, in communes, etc. How do you do that when the houses are all designed for the nuclear family? How do you suddenly rebuild millions of houses and apartments? Well, they found one solution. They would take a big palace and use it as one great commune location. But that didn't necessarily bring about the change they wanted in social relations. They were very serious about using science to bring about their goals, but they didn't realize it needs much more detailed work, and brute force will not bring about the change they want. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a successful, what I can do is point to long-term changes.
Could we potentially talk about the, was it Egypt in the Arab Spring or something, that Tunisia that went to democracy, at least seemingly so until now?
Well, the Arab Spring, unfortunately, is a classic example of within-system change. Tunisia could be an exception, and I think the reason why it could be an exception is because I visited there before the revolution, and in my view, it was more developed in terms of cultural and social relations than other Arab nations. So it was a different case, and it still has not reached anything like a democratic situation. I mean, it's far from that. It's precarious which way it's going to go. But I wish I'm not trying to dampen enthusiasm. I'm saying that psychologically, change in behavior is slow, particularly when you take it at the collective level. Sorry, yes.
You mentioned pre-revolution and after revolution, post-revolution, dictatorship is almost the same. Have you looked at that if dictatorship is worse after the revolution? Because wherever that we look, in Cambodia, in China, in Russia, in Arab world, Iran, the post-revolution is more dictatorship than pre-revolution. Why
Yes.
is like that?
Well, I come back to this discussion about progress in history. I started with the poem from Yeats suggesting a cyclical characteristic to history. And I referenced Pareto, elite theory, the idea that all societies will be governed by an elite under different propaganda. Now that view, the cyclical view, is contrasted with the progressive view that says, no, we're moving forward, we're making progress. And in some ways we are. Look at things like life expectancy, look at technical feats, look at AI and what it's doing. Yes, we're making progress, but revolutions don't necessarily move us forward culturally and socially and politically. Despite the technical advances, it is not inevitable that we're going to move forward politically. For example, at the end of this century, it may well be that dictatorships rule the world. I wouldn't like to bet which way. Look at the situation in the United States. we're in a precarious situation where we could have this potential dictator coming to power. And in terms of personality characteristics, Trump really is instinctively a dictator. Another book I wrote was on the psychology of dictatorship, and I discussed the personality characteristics of dictators, and Trump fits perfectly. So my message is we have to struggle for democracy and moving forward, and moderates have to think hard about how they're going to behave after the next revolution. If they behave as they have done in other revolutions, then we're in trouble. They need to watch out, because the extremists will not tolerate them. They will be out to wipe them out. Yes?
What do they do this?
Well, that's a good question. That's why I think we should think about this.
So you kind of repeatedly state that the fact that the moderates basically don't stand a chance if there is a revolution. But I'm wondering why, and this is sacrilegious in the Iranian community to talk about
Yes.
reform and talk about moderation as far as an approach. But why is it that the reformers, those who want to reform, while this system still exists, try not to push it to their limits to actually make those reforms without actually changing like the whole thing?
Well, let me answer your question in a slightly different way. I would say the moderates have a chance as long as they decide to take forceful action. They've got to almost behave against their own personality. They have to say, we're going to take charge and we're not going to allow the radicals to take charge. And they have to be determined in that. And they can't rely on discussions and debates and rationality.
But that makes them dictator. Yeah.
No. They can have rules that protect liberty, and they can protect those rules as fiercely as the extremists do. So it is a dilemma. There's no doubt it is a dilemma, because if you look after each of these great revolutions, the extremists take over. So we have the terror of the French Revolution wiping out so many people, including aristocrats who had been pro-revolution, including some of the best scientists in France who had been pro-revolution. They wiped them out. So how do you stop that? The moderates have to begin with a set of rules and say, we're sticking to this. And we're going to use severe tactics to defend these rules. Yes?
Let's talk about the hardwiring in the society. Will there be a shift of that hardwiring based on the shift of the personal beliefs or collective?
Can you elaborate, please?
For example, it's been 45 years since Islamic Republic has been in place. But from what I gather, if correctly, there is a shift in the mind of people about their belief in especially their religious beliefs. Will that shift in their personal beliefs change the hardwiring of the society in general?
I see, yes. There's no doubt that there's been a shift in personal attitudes and beliefs about religion in Iran. Will that impact the hardwiring outside? Well, I think it already has. It's beginning to affect the narratives people use, the rhetoric of everyday life. However, there are certain parts of the hardwiring that are part of the rituals of everyday life, and those have to change as well. Those have to change as well, and it takes time.
Will that shift speed up the process of that dam?
Yes, I think it will. I think it will. I think the process of the dam breaking is being speeded up. The problem is the list of things I went through as to what people have to experience and feel in order to participate in the revolution. One of them is they have to feel that there's an alternative to the present regime, and that's not clear yet. The other thing that has to happen is the moderates who get to power after the next regime change have to be adamant about protecting the rules that they set up. They can't be wishy-washy about it, because you know that the extremists are going to use extreme tactics and violence, and they might be the minority. Again, Khomeini and the students of the line of the Imam were the minority. They were not the majority, but they used radical tactics. One of them was to invade the American embassy. So the moderates have to be very clear about their determination and using force, if necessary, to protect what they have set up.
But that's exactly what the radicals are doing.
Yes, well, we have to use radical tactics.
So when you talk about moderates, my mind immediately goes to Kerensky's provisional government right after the first Russian Revolution.
Yes,
and obviously he was extremely wishy-washy.
Yes.
He wasn't consistent, and that's why it failed. I want to focus in on when you said the moderates keep talking about rights but not duties. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that, for example, in the middle of a revolution, there's chaos everywhere. We want to make sure that the farmers are still farming and the truck drivers are still delivering that food to grocery stores, so there's a semblance of normality?
Yes, yes,
chaos?
yes. If you look at the last half a century, the focus generally has been on rights. Everybody marches under the banner of rights. You know, women's rights, gay rights, black rights, etc. Nobody walks around saying, I want my duties. Everybody says, I want my rights. Mobilization is usually through rights. But what has to happen after a revolution is there has to be a quick shift to duties. If you keep the focus on rights, what you're doing is raising expectations, and this leads to relative deprivation. See, before the revolution, you're trying to make people feel deprived. You're trying to rouse them and say, you could have a better life. Raise their expectations. But after the revolution, you've got to decrease expectations. Otherwise, exactly, and that's where the moderates, again, didn't see what they have to do. They kept promising things, which is the wrong thing to do. See, the message from Khomeini very quickly after the revolution was, you're alive, that's basically good enough. Yes?
It seems like one of the struggles after regime change is that there's a difference amongst the groups that were advocating for revolution. Mm-hmm. What would happen if pre-regime change, during the revolution or in the planning of revolution, we acknowledged those differences and we sort of reconciled that we have different agendas and psychologies and potential tactics?
Well, that would be I mean, it has been tried in some ways, people, coordinating actions, but the problem is that if you take that approach, you're going to weaken the opposition greatly. And that's what the regime wants. The regime in power is constantly pointing to differences between groups and trying to isolate factions. So in theory, what you're saying makes good sense, but in practice, I don't think it would work, because you need all your forces mobilized to bring down the regime. Once you bring down the regime, that's when the problem starts, because all these different factions usually bring to power a wishy-washy moderate group, and because they are moderate, they listen to everybody and they're trying to make good decisions for everybody, and they're not saying, no, this is the path we're taking. And that becomes the problem.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
It seems like moderates don't want a revolution. Like, we don't want to deal with it after the revolution with extremism. I don't see that happening. So what are the other pathways for systems change?
Well, the other pathways are reform, but of course a regime that is dictatorial is not interested in reform. You're going back to the French king, you're going back to the Tsar in Russia. I mean, these people don't want reform. The Tsar, they tried reform with him, and it didn't really work. And Khomeini at the moment, he's not interested in reform. The view they have is if they give an inch, they're gone. Yes?
So it really does seem like once the revolution happens, we are on a very short timer.
Yes.
Before the radicals come in with their troops and their guns, the moderates, who need to be extraordinarily moral, extremely stable, and basically okay with using physical violence themselves, need to create their perfect system, because once that timer expires, the revolution is going to go out of control.
Exactly, correct.
Well, let me try to be more optimistic. I agree with you, the timer is short, because the extremists are waiting to pounce, and they will use any tactics necessary to get to power. So that is the challenge, that within a year or two you've got to get them sidelined. Now it seems to me one way to do that is to get, again, mass mobilization. We had this before the revolution. Mass mobilization against the extremists. But in order to do that, the moderates have to have strong leadership. See, one of the challenges is leadership. I wrote a book on political plasticity, and one of the chapters is on why do we still need leaders? Really, technically, we could do without leaders in many ways. We have the ability to connect everybody and ask them what they think about different issues. For example, should we invade a particular country? Yes or no? Should we build a particular road? Yes or no? We don't do that. We rely on leadership. And this leadership is very, in terms of style, is very difficult and slow to change. And yesterday I was in Dr. Milani's class, and I just pointed out that we have an election coming up in November, and it's between two 80-year-old men. That's a tradition that I believe goes back 10,000 years. it's a tradition that is ongoing. It's not new. And we're hoping to break it, but this is resilience, this is low political plasticity. It's a leadership style that has been with us for thousands of years. Yes?
I have a quick question. In terms of, for example, for moderates, using force to stay in power for the greater good, such as like maintaining democracy, wouldn't you say that the United States would kind of qualify, as in the republic itself, like overcoming slavery at some point, although it took a war, incorporating or institutionalizing civil rights, ultimately after some fights,
Yes.
and forcing out or rushing,
Yes.
and then like kind of keeping their leaders accountable to some extent, like in case of Nixon, I'm thinking
Yes.
up until now.
Yes.
No.
Right. Oh, I agree. You can take the example of the United States, starting with the revolution and gradual reform and change. My only addition would be that history doesn't just move in one direction. There are many examples of open societies closing, starting with the Athenian democracy collapsing, the Roman Republic becoming a dictatorship, on and on and on. There is no guarantee that societies that are open today will be open tomorrow. They could go backward. Yes?
You mentioned change between and change within. Coup d'etats falling. For example, do they provide better results as far as reaching the achievements? Just something came to my mind, like during the Qatar era, shifts made a coup, and it seems like events were better.
Yes, yes. Well, coup d'etats usually are within system change. You know, one person takes over through a small maneuver at the top. Now, there is a discussion about benign dictatorship. Some dictators have introduced some reforms and some done some good things in a country. I'm not denying that. However, generally, when there is dictatorship, there is corruption. It's inevitable. Even in psychological experiments, when we gather a group of people together and give one person power, that person becomes corrupt. They become corrupt in the sense that they distribute rewards in a biased way. So that is the problem I have with absolute power and dictatorship. Yes, sorry.
So I noticed as this talk was going on that I started thinking, okay, moderate, good, extremist, bad. But to your earlier point about how moderates, actually what a core feature of them is to see nuance, to see the fuzzy. I'm curious if you could actually help me balance this out a bit. What do we actually love about extremists? What do they offer? What should we value in them?
The problem with extremists is not necessarily the initial ideology or the initial goals or the tactics. It's what follows. If I read the speeches of Mao or Castro, you know, at the beginning, it sounds like heaven. You know, we're going to have wonderful things happening, and where it goes wrong is that dictator makes decisions and becomes the law in every sphere. It's like the quote I read from Lenin. The problem with dictators, Khomeini, Lenin, Stalin, any of them, is that whatever they say is law. And they have a personality that leads them to say things about everything. For example, Stalin believed that he had the absolute solution to Soviet agriculture. When some of the top geneticists disagreed with him, he jailed them. He said, I know how to do agriculture. And of course, famine followed. A lot of people died. When somebody like Khomeini makes a pronouncement, it doesn't matter what it's about. Whatever it is, that's the law. So it's not necessarily the initial issue, it's later on it gets worse.
Okay, I think that is a really fascinating answer because for me it brings up correlation and causation. We have ideology, like extremist ideology. This is point A, and then point B is if you have dictators carrying out this ideology. Would it be fair to say that it's correlated that extremist ideologies often are paired with extremist dictators, but that it's not necessarily causation, that we can actually have extremist ideology carried out in a non-dictator way?
It's possible, but one of the characteristics of people who believe in extremist ideology is that they are categorical thinkers, they tend to be Machiavellian, all these characteristics come along with it. Sorry,
listening to you, I want to suggest that there is a moderate who succeeded in the revolution and controlled the violence. It's in Iran. Reza Shah.
Yes.
Reza Shah, in my view, actually organized the revolution.
Yes.
And the two radical wings, the clergy and the left,
Yes.
he forced them to control it.
Yes.
And he brought about the hardware changes you mentioned.
Yes.
In Iranian society today, it's fundamentally changed because of the changes he made and the ability to control the radicals. The clergy wanted to take power, the left, the Soviets wanted to take power.
Mm-hmm.
He put them both down and
Right.
stayed on the path of moderation. Would you say that's a possible reading of history?
Yes, well, I agree that Reza Shah did amazing things, and he was obviously foundational to what happened in modern Iran and the progress. The problem is that there are very few such characters in history. Very few. By the way, revolutions are also rare in history. Most societies never have a revolution. Revolutions really are rare. Yes?
So you've been essentially talking about how the moderates, in a way, need to take advantage of the tactics of some of the more extreme people in order to take advantage of this brief time frame, or else just naturally they're going to be wiped away. The question I have is, what is preventing the moderates, after having adopted these tactics, from becoming, in a way, extremists themselves? Right?
Yeah.
Because being a moderate does not presuppose
Right.
right? And as you said yourself, the old adage, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
Taking this absolute power, even as a moderate, could lead to something like, for your example, Reza Shah may have been moderate, but then he was also an autocratic one.
Right. Well, by moderate, what I mean is people who set up pro-democracy rules and adhere to them themselves and are willing to use force to stop those rules being wiped out. So that's what I mean by moderate. I don't mean somebody who just decides to take power. I mean the rules have to be abided by the moderates themselves. Yes?
But those rules and those means of having a democratic society where people consult and compromise,
yes,
those have to be from within. You can't impose that.
Yes, I agree, but it seems to me that in any society that has mobilized, you're going to find that kind of talent. And it's usually people in prison. Think about the amount of talent that is in these prisons and the kinds of leadership they could provide. I'm pretty sure that, people say, well, there isn't leadership. Well, just look for it in the prisons. It's there. And the other point I would make is that one way to really move the moderates in the right direction is to put in a rule saying that a certain percentage of the parliament, or whatever it is you're going to have, has to be female. They did that in Rwanda after the genocide. After the genocide in Rwanda, they set a rule that at least 30% of the parliament have to be female. It improved things a lot. Right now in Rwanda, they have a record, a world record. 60% of the parliament are female. And it's moved things a lot in the right direction. Yes? Oh, sure. Sorry. Yes, sorry.
What is the role of people in this transition? It seems it's a battle of leaders. I don't see a role for people.
Yes. That's a great question. What is the role of people? I've been focusing a lot on leaders. Freud wrote a lot of nonsense. I once set myself the task of reading everything he'd ever written. It took about 6 months. I would get up early in the morning and read, and at the end of it I thought, God, what a lot of nonsense. But I think he's the only genius we've had in psychology. The 1% he got right is brilliant. It's only about 1%. What did he get right? I think in leadership he got it right. He said, in order for groups to perform at a very high level, they must have leaders. You cannot have a group performing at a very high level without leadership. And in revolutions and after revolutions, it turns out that leadership is absolutely essential. The quality of leadership. For example, why did the Bolsheviks win out? They were not the only communist group. They were not the biggest group. Why did they win out? I think it's because of Lenin. He was so shrewd. His tactics were just brilliant. Why did Khomeini win out? Or why did Mao win out? I think that's where a particular Machiavellianism, that is crucial in the leader. And it has to be there in the moderate leader as well. That's the problem.
Gandhi or Mandela didn't have those qualities, as far as we know.
Well, you're absolutely right. You could argue that Gandhi and Mandela were different. But I would say that George Washington was also different. The problem is there are so few of such leaders in history. George Washington is an exception to the rule that corruption comes from power. He had the ability to become king. He could have been king of America. He could have gone on as president, but he said, no, I've had my term, and he set the rule for term limits. How many men or women would do that? I don't think many. Mandela, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.